Introduction. Youth et. 1 to 25, 1469 to 94. Niccolò Machiavelli entered the world in Florence on the 3rd of May 1469, born to Bernardo, a lawyer of some standing, and his wife Bartolomea. Both parents claimed heritage from the old nobility of Florence. His life unfolded in 3 distinct phases, each mirroring a specific era in the turbulent history of his city. His youth coincided with the zenith of Florentine grandeur under the rule of Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent. This period of stability ended in 1494 with the downfall of the Medici, the very year Machiavelli stepped into public service. Florence in those days was a city pulled by opposing currents, the austere fervor of Savonarola and the opulent splendor of Lorenzo. The influence of the friar Savonarola upon the young Machiavelli appears to have been negligible. Indeed, in later writings, Machiavelli would use him merely as a cautionary example of the unarmed prophet who meets a tragic end. Conversely, the magnificence of the Medici rule left a deep impression, a sentiment echoed in his dedication of the prince to a grandson of that house. In his History of Florence, Machiavelli paints a vivid picture of the youth of his time, describing a generation more concerned with wit, elegant dress, and excess than with ancestral virtues, valuing the clever barb over true wisdom. Yet, a letter to his own son Guido reveals that Machiavelli's own youth was likely spent in diligent labor. He urges his son to study letters and music, reminding him that success and honor are the rewards of those who help themselves. Office at 2543, 1494, 1512. The second epoch of his life was dedicated to the service of the Free Republic of Florence, which governed the city from the expulsion of the Medici until their return in 1512. Rising to the post of Chancellor and Secretary to the Second Chancery, the Ten of Liberty and Peace, Machiavelli stood at the center of state affairs. His career is chronicled in the decrees and dispatches of the Republic, revealing the raw experiences that would later populate the pages of The Prince. His diplomatic missions brought him face to face with the movers of history. In 1499, he treated with Caterina Sforza, drawing from her the lesson that a prince's security lies more in the goodwill of the people than in stone fortresses. In France, he observed the failures of Louis XII, noting the 5 capital errors in statecraft that cost the king his Italian conquests. It was Louis who dissolved his marriage as a political bargaining chip with Pope Alexander VI, an act that Machiavelli would later reference when discussing the fidelity of princes. Much of his attention was consumed by the ambitions of Pope Alexander VI and his son, Cesare Borgia, the Duke Valentino. Machiavelli held up the Duke's actions as a model for those who would seize and keep power, finding no better instructor for a new prince. Yet, he also portrayed Cesare as a man who rose upon the fortunes of others and fell when those supports were withdrawn. Despite his prudence and preparation, Cesare was ultimately undone by an extraordinary and unforeseen stroke of fatality. Machiavelli witnessed the election of Julius II, seeing how Cesare was outmaneuvered by a cardinal he had previously offended, proving that great men do not forget old injuries for the sake of new benefits. He observed the impetuous Julius conduct his campaigns with a boldness that succeeded where caution would have failed, leading Machiavelli to muse on the nature of fortune. He also stood before the Emperor Maximilian, analyzing him as a secretive ruler hampered by a lack of force, one who ignored the human agents necessary to execute his will. The Republic's precarious existence amongst the giants of Europe, France, Spain, and the Church, ended with the Holy League of 1511. The return of the Medici in September 1512 signaled the death of the Republic and the ruin of Machiavelli's public career. Literature and Death, et 43-58, 1512-27. Dismissed from office in November 1512, Machiavelli's misfortunes deepened when he was accused of conspiracy, imprisoned, and tortured. Released by the intercession of the Medicean Pope Leo X, he retreated to his property at San Cassiano to devote himself to letters. In a letter to Francesco Vittori, he vividly describes this life of exile, spending his days in trivial diversions with rustics, but his nights in his study, clothed in regal court dress, conversing with the ancients. Nourished by this dialogue with the dead, he composed a treatise on principalities, pouring his experience into the work we know as The Prince. He originally intended to dedicate this little book to Giuliano de' Medici, hoping to prove his worth and loyalty, but it was ultimately inscribed to Lorenzo. There is no evidence that Lorenzo ever read it or offered Machiavelli employment. The work remained unpublished during his lifetime, plagiarized and circulating in manuscript form. In his plea to Vittori, Machiavelli pointed to his poverty as the ultimate proof of his honesty and loyalty. During these years of enforced leisure, he also produced the discourses on Livy, the art of war, and a history of Florence, the latter commissioned by the Medici once he had partly regained their favor. He presented this history to Clement VII in 1525, dedicating his work to the very family whose earlier fall had launched his career and whose return had ended it. But as the wheel of fortune turned once more with the sack of Rome in 1527 and the expulsion of the Medici, Machiavelli's hopes of regaining his old post were dashed. He died in Florence on June 22, 1527, without recovering his office. The man and his works. Though his resting place is unknown, Florence honors him with a cenotaph in Santa Croce, acknowledging him as a herald of Italian unity. The sinister reputation that haunts his name is a distortion unknown to his contemporaries. Modern research reveals a man of acute observation rather than an unholy necromancer. He was a diligent observer of the human condition, turning his insights into literature when the doors of statecraft were barred to him. In his own life, he was not the master of fortune he described. He was misled by Caterina Sforza, ignored by Louis XII, and overawed by Cesare Borgia. His attempts to strengthen Florence with a national militia failed miserably in the field. As a man, he was often timid and constrained by circumstance, but as a writer, he was without weakness. The Prince endures because it deals with the eternal realities of power rather than moral ideals. Its ethics reflect the brutal age of Machiavelli, yet its truths remain relevant wherever governments rely on material force. He illustrates his theories with historical figures, showing how men are ruined by their own simplicity and how the cloak of religion can mask a lack of faith and mercy. He teaches that in politics there is no perfectly safe course, only a choice between lesser perils. While he does not elevate government to a moral force, he argues that necessary wars are just wars, and arms are hallowed when they are the only hope. The translation of such a work demands fidelity to its pithy, muscular style. Machiavelli was no weaver of pretty phrases. Every word was weighed, his manner grave and serious. The aim here is to preserve the sharp brevity of the original, even at the cost of occasional roughness, for in The Prince there is a reason for the position of every word. The Prince. Chapter 3. Concerning mixed principalities. It is within the new principality that true difficulties arise. If the state is not entirely new, but rather a member grafted onto an existing government, forming what may be termed a mixed body, tumult is born first from a natural difficulty inherent in all new dominions. Men change their rulers willingly in the belief that they will better their lot. This belief leads them to take up arms against their current lord, but in this they deceive themselves, for experience later proves that they have merely exchanged bad for worse. This deterioration stems from another natural necessity. A new prince is always compelled to burden those who have submitted to him, either with his soldiery or with the infinite other hardships that conquest entails. Thus you find enemies in all those you have injured by seizing the principality, yet you cannot retain the friendship of those who placed you there. You cannot satisfy their expectations of reward, nor can you use strong medicines against them, being bound to them by obligation. For however strong one's armies may be, one always needs the goodwill of the inhabitants to enter a province. Cite, start. States acquired and added to an ancient state are either of the same country and language, or they are not. When they are, and especially when they are not accustomed to freedom, they are easily held. To possess them securely, it is enough to have extinguished the line of the prince who ruled them, for, in other matters, maintaining their old conditions and customs allows men to live quietly, as seen in Burgundy, Brittany, Gascony, and Normandy, which have long remained with France. The conqueror must merely observe two cautions. First, that the family of the former prince is extinguished. Second, that neither their laws nor their taxes are altered, so that the new and old states quickly become one body. But when dominions are acquired in a province differing in language, customs, and laws, here lie the difficulties. Here one needs great fortune and great diligence to hold them. One of the most effective remedies is for the person who acquires them to go and reside there. This makes possession more secure and durable, as the Turk has done in Greece. By being on the spot, one sees disorders as they spring up and can quickly remedy them. If absent, one hears of them only when they are too great to cure. Furthermore, the subjects are satisfied by direct recourse to the prince, giving them more reason to love him if they wish to be good, and to fear him if they wish to be otherwise. The other and better remedy is to send colonies to one or two places which act as fetters to that state. Colonies are not costly, they are more faithful and injure less, offending only those few whose fields and houses are taken to give to the new inhabitants. Those who are injured, being poor and scattered, can never do hurt, while the rest remain uninjured and afraid to err lest they too be despoiled. I conclude that these colonies are inexpensive and loyal, whereas maintaining a military garrison in their stead consumes the entire income of the state in wages, turning the acquisition into a loss and making enemies of the entire population through the hardships of quartering troops. Upon this, one must note that men ought either to be well treated or crushed, because they can avenge themselves of lighter injuries, but not of more serious ones. Therefore, the injury done to a man must be of such a kind that one does not stand in fear of his revenge. King Louis of France, however, did the contrary. He was brought into Italy by the ambition of the Venetians, who wished to gain half of Lombardy. He committed 5 capital errors. He destroyed the minor powers. He increased the strength of one of the greater powers in Italy, the Church. He brought in a foreign power, Spain. He did not settle in the country, and he did not send colonies. These errors might not have injured him had he not made a 6th, taking the state from the Venetians. Had he not aggrandized the Church or brought Spain into Italy, it would have been reasonable to humble Venice. But having taken those first steps, he should never have consented to their ruin, for they were a bulwark against the others. If any say King Louis ceded Romagna to Alexander and the kingdom to Spain to avoid war, I reply that one should never allow a disorder to persist in order to avoid a war, for war is not escaped, but merely deferred to your disadvantage. Thus, Louis lost Lombardy by not following the rules observed by those who have taken countries and wished to hold them. There is no miracle in this, but much that is reasonable. From this a general rule is drawn which rarely fails. He who is the cause of another becoming powerful is ruined because that power is generated by his own industry or force, and both are suspected by the one who has become powerful. Chapter 4. Why the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander, did not rebel against the successors of Alexander at his death side start. In the states governed by a prince and his servants, the prince has greater authority, for in all the country there is no one acknowledged as superior to him. The examples of these two kinds of government in our time are the Turk and the King of France. The monarchy of the Turk is governed by one lord, the others are his servants. He divides his kingdom into sanjaks and changes administrators at his will. The King of France, conversely, is placed amidst an ancient multitude of lords, acknowledged and loved by their own subjects, possessing privileges the king cannot take away without danger to himself. The contrary happens in kingdoms governed like France. One can easily enter by gaining over some baron, for there are always malcontents and those desiring change, but to hold it afterwards meets with infinite difficulties, both from those who assisted you and those you crushed. It is not enough to exterminate the prince's family, because the remaining lords make themselves heads of fresh movements. Unable to satisfy or destroy them all, you lose the state at the first opportunity. Now, considering the kingdom of Darius, it was similar to that of the Turk. Therefore, Alexander had to overthrow him completely in the field, after which, Darius being dead, the state remained secure to Alexander. Had his successors been united, they would have enjoyed it at their ease, but states constituted like France cannot be held with such tranquility. Hence arose the frequent rebellions in Spain, France, and Greece against the Romans, owing to the many principalities within those states. It was not the ability of the conqueror that determined the ease of holding the acquisition, but the lack of uniformity in the subject state. The Prince. Chapter 5. Concerning the way to govern cities or principalities which lived under their own laws before they were annexed. When those states which have been acquired are accustomed to living by their own laws and in freedom, there are 3 modes for those who wish to hold them. The first is to ruin them. The next is to reside there in person. The third is to permit them to live under their own laws, drawing a tribute and establishing within it an oligarchy which will keep it friendly to you. Such a government being created by the prince knows that it cannot stand without his friendship and power, and does its utmost to support him. And therefore, he who would keep a city accustomed to freedom will hold it more easily by the means of its own citizens than in any other way. We have the examples of the Spartans and the Romans. The Spartans held Athens and Thebes, establishing there an oligarchy. Nevertheless, they lost them. The Romans, in order to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia, dismantled them and did not lose them. They wished to hold Greece as the Spartans held it, making it free and permitting its laws, and did not succeed. So to hold it, they were compelled to dismantle many cities in the country, for in truth there is no safe way to retain them otherwise than by ruining them. He who becomes master of a city accustomed to freedom and does not destroy it, may expect to be destroyed by it, for in rebellion it has always the watchword of liberty and its ancient privileges as a rallying point which neither time nor benefits will ever cause it to forget. And whatever you may do or provide against, they never forget that name or their privileges unless they are disunited or dispersed, but at every chance they immediately rally to them, as Pisa did after the 100 years she had been held in bondage by the Florentines. Chapter 6. Concerning new principalities which are acquired by one's own arms and ability, I say therefore that in entirely new principalities, where there is a new prince, more or less difficulty is found in keeping them, accordingly as there is more or less ability in him who has acquired the state. Now, as the fact of becoming a prince from a private station presupposes either ability or fortune, it is clear that one or other of these things will mitigate in some degree many difficulties. Nevertheless, he who has relied least on fortune is established the strongest. Further, it facilitates matters when the prince, having no other state, is compelled to reside there in person. Cite start, and in examining their actions and lives one cannot see that they owed anything to fortune beyond opportunity, which brought them the material to mold into the form which seemed best to them. Without that opportunity their powers of mind would have been extinguished, and without those powers the opportunity would have come in vain. It was necessary, therefore, to Moses that he should find the people of Israel in Egypt enslaved and oppressed, in order that they should be disposed to follow him so as to be delivered out of bondage. It was necessary that Romulus should not remain in Alba, and that he should be abandoned at his birth, in order that he should become king of Rome and founder of the fatherland. It was necessary that Cyrus should find the Persians discontented with the government of the Medes, and the Medes soft and effeminate through their long peace. Theseus could not have shown his ability had he not found the Athenians dispersed. These opportunities, therefore, made those men fortunate, and their high ability enabled them to recognize the opportunity whereby their country was ennobled and made famous. Those who by valorous ways become princes, like these men, acquire a principality with difficulty, but they keep it with ease. The difficulties they have in acquiring it rise in part from the new rules and methods which they are forced to introduce to establish their government and its security. And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success, than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents, who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men, who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience of them. It is necessary, therefore, if we desire to discuss this matter thoroughly, to inquire whether these innovators can rely on themselves or have to depend on others. That is to say, whether, to consummate their enterprise, have they to use prayers or can they use force? In the first instance, they always succeed badly and never compass anything. But when they can rely on themselves and use force, then they are rarely endangered. Hence it is that all armed prophets have conquered, and the unarmed ones have been destroyed. Besides the reasons mentioned, the nature of the people is variable, and whilst it is easy to persuade them, it is difficult to fix them in that persuasion. And thus it is necessary to take such measures that, when they believe no longer, it may be possible to make them believe by force. Chapter 7. Concerning new principalities which are acquired, either by the arms of others or by good fortune, cite start. Concerning these two methods of rising to be a prince by ability or fortune, I wish to adduce two examples within our own recollection, and these are Francesco Sforza and Cesare Borgia. Francesco, by proper means and with great ability, from being a private person, rose to be Duke of Milan, and that which he had acquired with 1,000 anxieties he kept with little trouble. On the other hand, Cesare Borgia, called by the people Duke Valentino, acquired his state during the ascendancy of his father, and on its decline he lost it, notwithstanding that he had taken every measure and done all that ought to be done by a wise and able man to fix firmly his roots in the states which the arms and fortunes of others had bestowed on him. Because, as is stated above, he who has not first laid his foundations may be able with great ability to lay them afterwards, but they will be laid with trouble to the architect and danger to the building, cite start. And as this point is worthy of notice, and to be imitated by others, I am not willing to leave it out. When the Duke occupied the Romagna, he found it under the rule of weak masters who rather plundered their subjects than ruled them, and gave them more cause for disunion than for union, so that the country was full of robbery, quarrels, and every kind of violence. And so, wishing to bring back peace and obedience to authority, he considered it necessary to give it a good governor. Thereupon he promoted Messer Ramiro d'Orco, a swift and cruel man, to whom he gave the fullest power. This man in a short time restored peace and unity with the greatest success. Afterwards the Duke considered that it was not advisable to confer such excessive authority, for he had no doubt but that it would become odious. So he set up a court of judgment in the country, under a most excellent president, wherein all cities had their advocates. And, because he knew that the past severity had caused some hatred against himself, so to clear himself in the minds of the people and gain them entirely to himself, he desired to show that, if any cruelty had been practiced, it had not originated with him, but in the natural sternness of the minister. Under this pretense he took Ramiro, and one morning caused him to be executed and left on the piazza at Cesena with the block and a bloody knife at his side. The barbarity of this spectacle caused the people to be at once satisfied and dismayed. But let us return whence we started. I say that the Duke, finding himself now sufficiently powerful and partly secured from immediate dangers by having armed himself in his own way, and having in a great measure crushed those forces in his vicinity that could injure him if he wished to proceed with his conquest, had next to consider France, for he knew that the king, who too late was aware of his mistake, would not support him. And from this time he began to seek new alliances and to temporize with France. But as to the future, he had to fear, in the first place, that a new successor to the Church might not be friendly to him, and might seek to take from him that which Alexander had given him. So he decided to act in 4 ways. Firstly, by exterminating the families of those lords whom he had despoiled so as to take away that pretext from the Pope. Secondly, by winning to himself all the gentlemen of Rome so as to be able to curb the Pope with their aid. Thirdly, by converting the college more to himself. Fourthly, by acquiring so much power before the Pope should die that he could by his own measures resist the first shock. But Alexander died 5 years after he had first drawn the sword. He left the Duke with the state of Romagna alone consolidated, with the rest in the air, between 2 most powerful hostile armies, and sick unto death. Yet there were in the Duke such boldness and ability, and he knew so well how men are to be won or lost, and so firm were the foundations which in so short a time he had laid, that if he had not had those armies on his back, or if he had been in good health, he would have overcome all difficulties. If he could not have made Pope him whom he wished, at least the one whom he did not wish would not have been elected. But if he had been in sound health at the death of Alexander, everything would have been different to him. On the day that Julius II was elected, he told me that he had thought of everything that might occur at the death of his father, and had provided a remedy for all, except that he had never anticipated that, when the death did happen, he himself would be on the point to die. When all the actions of the Duke are recalled, I do not know how to blame him, but rather it appears to be, as I have said, that I ought to offer him for imitation to all those who, by the fortune or the arms of others, are raised to government, because he, having a lofty spirit and far-reaching aims, could not have regulated his conduct otherwise, and only the shortness of the life of Alexander and his own sickness frustrated his designs. Only can he be blamed for the election of Julius II, in whom he made a bad choice, because, as is said, not being able to elect a pope to his own mind, he could have hindered any other from being elected pope. And he ought never to have consented to the election of any cardinal whom he had injured or who had cause to fear him if they became pontiffs. For men injure either from fear or hatred. Therefore the Duke erred in his choice, and it was the cause of his ultimate ruin. The Prince. Chapter 8. Concerning those who have obtained a principality by wickedness. Agathocles. The Sicilian rose not merely from a private station, but from a low and abject fortune to become king of Syracuse. Born of a potter, he led a life of infamy at every stage of his career, yet he combined his wickedness with such strength of mind and body that, having entered the military, he rose through the ranks to become praetor of Syracuse. Once established in this rank, he resolved to become prince and to hold by violence and without obligation to others that which had been conceded to him by common consent. He came to an understanding with Hamilcar, the Carthaginian, who was waging war in Sicily with his armies. In our own times, during the pontificate of Alexander VI, there was Oliverotto da Fermo. Having been left an orphan young, he was raised by his maternal uncle Giovanni Fogliani and sent in his early youth to serve under Paolo Vitelli, so that, trained in that discipline, he might attain some high military rank. After Paolo died, he fought under his brother Vitellozzo, and in a very short time, being endowed with wit and a vigorous body and mind, became the first man in his profession. But deeming it servile to take orders from others, he conspired with certain citizens of Fermo, to whom the slavery of their country was dearer than its liberty, and with the aid of the Vitelleschi, to seize Fermo. After passing some days there and arranging what was necessary for his wicked design, Oliverotto gave a solemn banquet to which he invited Giovanni Fogliani and the leading men of Fermo. When the meal and the entertainments usual at such banquets were finished, Oliverotto artfully began a grave discussion, speaking of the greatness of Pope Alexander and his son Cesare, and of their enterprises. When Giovanni and the others replied to this, Oliverotto rose, saying such matters should be spoken of in a more private place, and withdrew to a chamber, followed by Giovanni and the other citizens. No sooner were they seated than soldiers issued from secret places and slaughtered Giovanni and all the others. Chapter 9. Concerning a civil principality. A principality is created either by the people or by the nobles, accordingly as one or the other has the opportunity. The nobles, seeing they cannot withstand the people, begin to cry up the reputation of one of themselves, and they make him a prince, so that under his shadow they can give vent to their ambitions. The people, finding they cannot resist the nobles, also cry up the reputation of one of themselves and make him a prince so as to be defended by his authority. Furthermore, a prince can never secure himself against a hostile people because of there being too many, whilst from the nobles he can secure himself as they are few in number. The worst a prince may expect from a hostile people is to be abandoned by them. But from hostile nobles he has not only to fear abandonment, but also that they will rise against him, for they, being more far-seeing and astute, always come forward in time to save themselves and to obtain favours from him whom they expect to win. Therefore, one who becomes a prince through the favour of the people ought to keep them friendly, and this he can easily do, seeing they only ask not to be oppressed. But one who, in opposition to the people, becomes a prince by the favour of the nobles, ought above everything to seek to win the people over to himself, and this he may easily do if he takes them under his protection. Because men, when they receive good from him, of whom they were expecting evil, are bound more closely to their benefactor. Thus the people quickly become more devoted to him than if he had been raised to the principality by their favours. Chapter 10. Concerning the way in which the strength of all principalities ought to be measured. The first case has been discussed. Of the second case one can say nothing except to encourage such princes to provision and fortify their towns, and not on any account to defend the country. Whoever shall fortify his town well, and shall have managed the other concerns of his subjects in the way stated above, will never be attacked without great caution. Men are always adverse to enterprises where difficulties can be seen, and it is not an easy thing to attack one who has his town well fortified and is not hated by his people. Therefore, a prince who has a strong city and has not made himself odious will not be attacked, or if anyone should attack, he will only be driven off with disgrace. If anyone should reply, if the people have property outside the city and see it burnt, they will not remain patient, and the long siege and self-interest will make them forget their prince, I answer that a powerful and courageous prince will overcome all such difficulties. He will give at one time hope to his subjects that the evil will not be for long, at another time fear of the cruelty of the enemy, then preserving himself adroitly from those subjects who seem to him to be too bold. Chapter 11. Concerning ecclesiastical principalities. Such principalities only are secure and happy, but being upheld by powers to which the human mind cannot reach, I shall speak no more of them, because, being exalted and maintained by God, it would be the act of a presumptuous and rash man to discuss them. Nevertheless, if anyone should ask of me how it comes that the Church has attained such greatness in temporal power, seeing that before Alexander, the Italian potentates, and even the smallest barons, valued the temporal power very slightly, yet now a king of France trembles before it, it does not appear to me superfluous to recall it to memory. And although there might arise sometimes a courageous pope such as Sixtus, yet neither fortune nor wisdom could rid him of these annoyances. The short life of a pope is also a cause of weakness, for in the 10 years, which is the average life of a pope, he can with difficulty lower one of the factions. And if one pope should almost destroy the Colonnesi, another would arise hostile to the Orsini, who would support their opponents, and yet would not have time to ruin the Orsini. For these reasons, His Holiness Pope Leo found the pontificate most powerful, and it is to be hoped that, if others made it great in arms, he will make it still greater and more venerated by his goodness and infinite other virtues. The Prince. Chapter 12. How many kinds of soldiery there are, and concerning mercenaries. Having traversed the particulars of principalities and the modes of their governance, it is now necessary to discuss generally the means of offense and defense available to every state. We have established that a prince must lay solid foundations, otherwise he will inevitably perish. The principal foundations of all states, whether new, old, or mixed, are good laws and good arms. And because good laws cannot exist where arms are not good, and where arms are good, laws must be good, I shall pass over the laws and speak of arms. The forces with which a prince defends his state are either his own, or they are mercenaries, auxiliaries, or a mixture of these. Mercenaries and auxiliaries are useless and dangerous. If a prince holds his state based on these arms, he will stand neither firm nor safe, for they are disunited, ambitious, without discipline, and unfaithful. They are valiant before friends, but cowardly before enemies. They have neither the fear of God nor fidelity to men, and destruction is deferred only so long as the attack is deferred. In peace, one is robbed by them, and in war by the enemy. The cause of this is that they have no other love or reason to keep them in the field than a trifling wage, which is not sufficient to make them willing to die for you. They are ready enough to be your soldiers while you remain at peace, but when war comes, they either fly or run away. This requires little proof, for the ruin of Italy has been caused by nothing else than resting all her hopes for many years on mercenaries. Although they formerly made some display and appeared valiant amongst themselves, when the foreigner came, they showed their true nature. Thus it was that Charles, King of France, was allowed to seize Italy with chalk in hand, marking his quarters without resistance. Mercenary captains are either capable men or they are not. If they are, you cannot trust them because they always aspire to their own greatness, either by oppressing you, their master, or by oppressing others contrary to your intentions. If the captain is not skillful, you are ruined in the usual way. If it be urged that any armed captain will act thus, I reply that when arms have to be resorted to, the prince ought to go in person and perform the duty of a captain. The republic has to send its citizens. Experience has shown princes and republics single-handed, making the greatest progress, and mercenaries doing nothing except damage. Rome and Sparta stood for many ages armed and free. The Swiss are completely armed and quite free. Of ancient mercenaries, we have the example of the Carthaginians, who were oppressed by their mercenary soldiers after the first war with the Romans, even though they had their own citizens as captains. Philip of Macedon was made captain of their soldiers by the Thebans after the death of Epaminondas, and after victory he took away their liberty. In modern times, the Milanese enlisted Francesco Sforza against the Venetians. Having overcome the enemy at Caravaggio, he allied himself with them to crush his masters, the Milanese. Sforza's father, having been engaged by Queen Johanna of Naples, left her unprotected, forcing her to throw herself into the arms of the King of Aragon to save her kingdom. The Venetians acted safely and gloriously so long as they fought with their own men. But when they began to fight on land, they forsook this virtue and followed the custom of Italy. When their expansion began, having little territory and great reputation, they had little to fear from their captains. But as they expanded under Carmignuola, they tasted this error, for finding him a valiant man who had beaten the Duke of Milan, yet seeing him lukewarm in the war, they feared they would no longer conquer under him. Unable to let him go for fear of losing what they had acquired, they were compelled to murder him to secure themselves. Since these examples have led me to Italy, which has been ruled for many years by mercenaries, I wish to discuss them more seriously. You must understand that as the empire lost authority in Italy and the Pope acquired more temporal power, Italy was divided into more states. Many great cities took up arms against their nobles, and the church favored them to gain authority. Thus, Italy fell into the hands of the church and a few republics. Since the priests and citizens were unaccustomed to arms, they began to enlist foreigners. The result of their valor has been that Italy has been overrun by Charles, robbed by Louis, ravaged by Ferdinand, and insulted by the Switzers. Their method was to lower the credit of infantry to increase their own, reducing war to a game without fatigue or danger, bringing Italy to slavery and contempt. Chapter 13. Concerning auxiliaries, mixed soldiery and one's own auxiliaries, the other useless arm, are employed when a prince calls in a powerful neighbor to aid and defend him, as Pope Julius II did in his enterprise against Ferrara, turning to Ferdinand of Spain. These arms may be useful and good in themselves, but for him who calls them in, they are always disadvantageous. For losing, one is undone, and winning, one is their captive. Although ancient history is full of examples, I will not leave this recent one of Pope Julius II, whose peril was great. Wishing to take Ferrara, he threw himself entirely into the hands of a foreigner. But his good fortune brought about a third event, so he did not reap the fruit of his rash choice. His auxiliaries were routed at Ravenna, but the Swiss rose and drove out the conquerors, so he escaped being a prisoner to his enemies who had fled, or to his auxiliaries, having conquered by other arms. Therefore let him who has no desire to conquer make use of these arms, for they are much more hazardous than mercenaries. With auxiliaries the ruin is ready-made. They are all united, all yield obedience to others. But with mercenaries, even after victory, they need more time and opportunity to injure you, for they are not one community and are paid by you. A third party you make their head cannot immediately assume enough authority to injure you. In conclusion, in mercenaries, dastardly cowardice is most dangerous. In auxiliaries, valor. The wise prince has always avoided these arms and turned to his own, willing rather to lose with them than to conquer with the others, judging that no real victory is gained with the arms of others. I shall never hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia. This duke entered the Romagna with auxiliaries, taking French soldiers to capture Imola and Forli. But finding them unreliable, he turned to mercenaries, enlisting the Orsini and Vitelli. Finding them also doubtful and unfaithful, he destroyed them and turned to his own men. The difference in reputation is clear. He was never esteemed so highly as when everyone saw he was complete master of his own forces. I wish also to recall Hiero the Syracusan. Made head of the army, he soon found the mercenary soldiery useless. Seeing he could neither keep them nor let them go, he had them all cut to pieces and afterwards made war with his own forces. I also recall a figure from the Old Testament. David offered to fight Goliath, and Saul armed him with his own weapons. David rejected them, saying he could not make use of them, and wished to meet the enemy with his sling and knife. In short, the arms of others either fall from your back, or they weigh you down, or they bind you fast. Charles VII, father of Louis XI, having liberated France from the English by valor and fortune, recognized the necessity of being armed with his own forces and established ordinances for men-at-arms and infantry. His son, Louis, abolished the infantry and began to enlist the Swiss. This mistake, followed by others, is the source of peril to that kingdom, for by raising the reputation of the Swiss, he diminished the value of his own arms, destroying the infantry and subordinating his men-at-arms to others. Accustomed to fighting with the Swiss, the French now believe they cannot conquer without them. I conclude, therefore, that no principality is secure without having its own forces. On the contrary, it is entirely dependent on good fortune, not having the valor to defend it in adversity. One's own forces are those composed of subjects, citizens, or dependents. All others are mercenaries or auxiliaries. Chapter 14. That which concerns a prince on the subject of the art of war. A prince ought to have no other aim or thought, nor select anything else for his study, than war and its rules and discipline. For this is the sole art that belongs to him who rules. It is of such force that it not only upholds those born princes, but often enables men to rise from a private station to that rank. Conversely, when princes have thought more of ease than of arms, they have lost their states. The first cause of losing a state is neglecting this art. The means of acquiring it is mastery of this art. Francesco Sforza, through being marshal from a private person, became Duke of Milan. His sons, through avoiding the hardships of arms, from dukes became private persons. Being unarmed causes you to be despised, which is an ignominy a prince must guard against. There is no comparison between the armed and the unarmed. It is unreasonable that the armed should obey the unarmed willingly, or that the unarmed be secure among armed servants. With disdain in the one and suspicion in the other, they cannot work well together. Therefore, a prince who does not understand the art of war cannot be respected by his soldiers, nor rely on them. He ought never to have this subject out of his thoughts, and in peace he should addict himself to it more than in war. This he can do in two ways, by action and by study. As regards action, he must keep his men well organized and drilled. He must incessantly follow the chase, accustoming his body to hardships and learning the nature of the terrain. how mountains rise, valleys open, and plains lie, and understanding rivers and marshes. This knowledge is useful in two ways. First, he learns to know and defend his country. Second, he learns to understand any other locality he may need to study, for the hills and valleys of Tuscany resemble those of other provinces. The prince who lacks this skill lacks the essential quality of a captain, the ability to surprise the enemy, select quarters, lead armies, and besiege towns to advantage. Philopoemen, prince of the Achaeans, is praised because in peace he never had anything in his mind but the rules of war. When abroad with friends, he would stop and reason. If the enemy were on that hill, and we here, who has the advantage? How should we advance? How retreat? He would listen to their opinions and state his own, confirming it with reasons, so that in war no unexpected circumstance could arise that he could not deal with. But to exercise the intellect, the prince should read histories, studying the actions of illustrious men to examine the causes of victory and defeat, avoiding the latter and imitating the former. He should do as great men have done, taking as an exemplar one who was praised and famous. As Alexander imitated Achilles, Caesar imitated Alexander, and Scipio imitated Cyrus. Whoever reads the life of Cyrus by Xenophon will recognize in the life of Scipio how that imitation was his glory, and how Scipio conformed to the chastity, affability, humanity, and liberality written of Cyrus. A wise prince ought to observe such rules, never standing idle in peace, but increasing his resources with industry to be available in adversity, so that if fortune changes she may find him prepared to resist her blows. The Prince. Chapter 15. Concerning things for which men, and especially princes, are praised or blamed. It remains now to define the rules of conduct for a prince towards his subjects and his friends. I am aware that many have written on this point, and I fear I may be considered presumptuous in discussing it again, especially as I intend to depart from the methods of other people. But since my intention is to write something useful for those who understand it, it appears more appropriate to me to pursue the real truth of the matter rather than the imagination of it. For many have pictured republics and principalities, which in fact have never been known or seen, because the gulf between how one lives and how one ought to live is so wide that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done seeks his own ruin rather than his preservation. A man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. Hence it is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong, and to make use of it or not according to necessity. Therefore, putting aside imaginary things concerning a prince and discussing those which are real, I say that all men, and especially princes for being more highly placed, are noted for qualities that bring them either blame or praise. Thus one is reputed liberal, another miserly, one is reputed generous, one rapacious, one cruel, one compassionate, one faithless, another faithful, one effeminate and cowardly, another bold and brave, one affable, another haughty, one lascivious, another chaste, one sincere, another cunning, one hard, another easy, one grave, another frivolous, one religious, another unbelieving. I know that everyone will confess that it would be most praiseworthy in a prince to exhibit all the above qualities that are considered good. But because they can neither be entirely possessed nor observed, for human conditions do not permit it, it is necessary for him to be sufficiently prudent that he may know how to avoid the reproach of those vices which would lose him his state, and also to keep himself, if it be possible, from those which would not lose him it. But if this is not possible, he may with less hesitation abandon himself to them, and again he need not make himself uneasy at incurring a reproach for those vices, without which the state can only be saved with difficulty. For if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which looks like virtue, if followed, would be his ruin, whilst something else, which looks like vice, yet followed brings him security and prosperity. Chapter 16. Concerning liberality and meanness. Commencing then with the first of the above-named characteristics, I say that it would be well to be reputed liberal. Nevertheless, liberality exercised in a way that does not bring you the reputation for it injures you. For if one exercises it honestly, and as it should be exercised, it may not become known, and you will not avoid the reproach of its opposite. Therefore, anyone wishing to maintain among men the name of liberal is obliged to avoid no attribute of magnificence, so that a prince thus inclined will consume in such acts all his property, and will be compelled in the end, if he wish to maintain the name of liberal, to unduly weigh down his people, and tax them, and do everything he can to get money. This will soon make him odious to his subjects, and becoming poor, he will be little valued by anyone. Thus, with his liberality, having offended many and rewarded few, he is affected by the very first trouble and imperiled by whatever may be the first danger. Recognizing this himself and wishing to draw back from it, he runs at once into the reproach of being miserly. Therefore, a prince, not being able to exercise this virtue of liberality in such a way that it is recognized, except to his cost, if he is wise, he ought not to fear the reputation of being mean, for in time he will come to be more considered than if liberal, seeing that with his economy his revenues are enough, that he can defend himself against all attacks, and is able to engage in enterprises without burdening his people. Thus it comes to pass that he exercises liberality towards all from whom he does not take, who are numberless, and meanness towards those to whom he does not give, who are few. We have not seen great things done in our time except by those who have been considered mean. The rest have failed. Pope Julius II was assisted in reaching the papacy by a reputation for liberality, yet he did not strive afterwards to keep it up when he made war on the King of France, and he made many wars without imposing any extraordinary tax on his subjects, for he supplied his additional expenses out of his long thriftiness. The present King of Spain would not have undertaken or conquered in so many enterprises if he had been reputed liberal. A prince, therefore, provided that he has not to rob his subjects, that he can defend himself, that he does not become poor and abject, that he is not forced to become rapacious, ought to hold of little account a reputation for being mean, for it is one of those vices which will enable him to govern. And if anyone should say, Caesar obtained empire by liberality, and many others have reached the highest positions by having been liberal, and by being considered so, I answer, either you are a prince in fact, or in a way to become one. In the first case, this liberality is dangerous. In the second, it is very necessary to be considered liberal. And Caesar was one of those who wished to become preeminent in Rome. But if he had survived after becoming so, and had not moderated his expenses, he would have destroyed his government. And if anyone should reply, many have been princes and have done great things with armies who have been considered very liberal, I reply, either a prince spends that which is his own or his subjects, or else that of others. In the first case he ought to be sparing, in the second he ought not to neglect any opportunity for liberality. And to the prince who goes forth with his army, supporting it by pillage, sack, and extortion, handling that which belongs to others, this liberality is necessary, otherwise he would not be followed by soldiers, and of that which is neither yours nor your subjects you can be a ready giver, as were Cyrus, Caesar, and Alexander, because it does not take away your reputation if you squander that of others, but adds to it. It is only squandering your own that injures you. And there is nothing wastes so rapidly as liberality, for even whilst you exercise it you lose the power to do so, and so become either poor or despised, or else, in avoiding poverty, rapacious and hated. And a prince should guard himself, above all things, against being despised and hated, and liberality leads you to both. Therefore, it is wiser to have a reputation for meanness, which brings reproach without hatred, than to be compelled through seeking a reputation for liberality to incur a name for rapacity, which begets reproach with hatred. Chapter 7. Concerning cruelty and clemency, and whether it is better to be loved than feared. Coming now to the other qualities mentioned above, I say that every prince ought to desire to be considered clement and not cruel. Nevertheless, he ought to take care not to misuse this clemency. Cesare Borgia was considered cruel. Notwithstanding, his cruelty reconciled the Romagna, unified it, and restored it to peace and loyalty. And if this be rightly considered, he will be seen to have been much more merciful than the Florentine people, who, to avoid a reputation for cruelty, permitted Pistoia to be destroyed. Therefore a prince, so long as he keeps his subjects united and loyal, ought not to mind the reproach of cruelty, because with a few examples he will be more merciful than those who, through too much mercy, allow disorders to arise, from which follow murders or robberies. For these are wont to injure the whole people, whilst those executions which originate with a prince offend the individual only. And of all princes, it is impossible for the new prince to avoid the imputation of cruelty, owing to new states being full of dangers. Upon this a question arises, whether it be better to be loved than feared, or feared than loved. It may be answered that one should wish to be both, but, because it is difficult to unite them in one person, it is much safer to be feared than loved when of the two either must be dispensed with. because this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, as is said above, when the need is far distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you. And that prince who, relying entirely on their promises, has neglected other precautions is ruined. Because friendships that are obtained by payments, and not by greatness or nobility of mind, may indeed be earned, but they are not secured, and in time of need cannot be relied upon. And men have less scruple in offending one who is beloved than one who is feared. For love is preserved by the link of obligation which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment which never fails. Nevertheless, a prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated, which will always be as long as he abstains from the property of his citizens and subjects and from their women. But when it is necessary for him to proceed against the life of someone, he must do it on proper justification and for manifest cause. But above all things he must keep his hands off the property of others, because men more quickly forget the death of their father than the loss of their patrimony. Besides, pretexts for taking away the property are never wanting, for he who has once begun to live by robbery will always find pretexts for seizing what belongs to others. But reasons for taking life, on the contrary, are more difficult to find and sooner lapse. But when a prince is with his army and has under control a multitude of soldiers, then it is quite necessary for him to disregard the reputation of cruelty, for without it he would never hold his army united or disposed to its duties. Among the wonderful deeds of Hannibal, this one is enumerated, that having led an enormous army composed of many various races of men to fight in foreign lands, no dissensions arose either among them or against the prince, whether in his bad or in his good fortune. This arose from nothing else than his inhuman cruelty, which with his boundless valor made him revered and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. But without that cruelty, his other virtues would not have been sufficient to produce this effect. And short-sighted writers admire his deeds from one point of view, and from another condemn the principal cause of them. That it is true his other virtues would not have been sufficient for him may be proved by the case of Scipio, that most excellent man, not only of his own times, but within the memory of man, against whom, nevertheless, his army rebelled in Spain. This arose from nothing but his too great forbearance, which gave his soldiers more license than is consistent with military discipline. For this he was upbraided in the Senate by Fabius Maximus, and called the corrupter of the Roman soldiery. Returning to the question of being feared or loved, I come to the conclusion that men loving according to their own will and fearing according to that of the prince, a wise prince should establish himself on that which is in his own control and not in that of others. He must endeavor only to avoid hatred, as is noted. Chapter C8. Concerning the way in which princes should keep faith. Everyone admits how praiseworthy it is in a prince to keep faith and to live with integrity and not with craft. Nevertheless, our experience has been that those princes who have done great things have held good faith of little account, and have known how to circumvent the intellect of men by craft, and in the end have overcome those who have relied on their word. You must know there are two ways of contesting, the one by the law, the other by force. The first method is proper to men, the second to beasts. But because the first is frequently not sufficient, it is necessary to have recourse to the second. Therefore it is necessary for a prince to understand how to avail himself of the beast and the man. This has been figuratively taught to princes by ancient writers, who describe how Achilles and many other princes of old were given to the centaur Chiron to nurse, who brought them up in his discipline, which means solely that, as they had for a teacher one who was half beast and half man, so it is necessary for a prince to know how to make use of both natures, and that one without the other is not durable. A prince, therefore, being compelled knowingly to adopt the beast, ought to choose the fox and the lion, because the lion cannot defend himself against snares, and the fox cannot defend himself against wolves. Therefore, it is necessary to be a fox to discover the snares, and a lion to terrify the wolves. Those who rely simply on the lion do not understand what they are about. Therefore a wise lord cannot, nor ought he to, keep faith when such observance may be turned against him, and when the reasons that caused him to pledge it exist no longer. If men were entirely good, this precept would not hold, but because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to observe it with them. Nor will there ever be wanting to a prince legitimate reasons to excuse this non-observance. Of this endless modern examples could be given, showing how many treaties and engagements have been made void and of no effect through the faithlessness of princes. And he who has known best how to employ the fox has succeeded best. But it is necessary to know well how to disguise this characteristic, and to be a great pretender and dissembler. And men are so simple and so subject to present necessities that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived. One recent example I cannot pass over in silence. Alexander VI did nothing else but deceive men, nor ever thought of doing otherwise, and he always found victims. For there never was a man who had greater power in asserting, or who with greater oaths would affirm a thing, yet would observe it less. Nevertheless, his deceits always succeeded according to his wishes, because he well understood this side of mankind. Therefore it is unnecessary for a prince to have all the good qualities I have enumerated, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. And I shall dare to say this also, that to have them and always to observe them is injurious, and that to appear to have them is useful, to appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, upright, and to be so, but with a mind so framed that should you require not to be so, you may be able and know how to change to the opposite. And you have to understand this, that a prince, especially a new one, cannot observe all those things for which men are esteemed, being often forced, in order to maintain the state, to act contrary to fidelity, friendship, humanity, and religion. Therefore, it is necessary for him to have a mind ready to turn itself accordingly as the winds and variations of fortune force it, yet, as I have said above, not to diverge from the good if he can avoid doing so, but if compelled, then to know how to set about it. For this reason, a prince ought to take care that he never lets anything slip from his lips that is not replete with the above-named 5 qualities, that he may appear to him who sees and hears him altogether merciful, faithful, humane, upright, and religious. There is nothing more necessary to appear to have than this last quality, inasmuch as men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you. Everyone sees what you appear to be, few really know what you are, and those few dare not oppose themselves to the opinion of the many, who have the majesty of the state to defend them. And in the actions of all men, and especially of princes, which it is not prudent to challenge, one judges by the result. For that reason, let a prince have the credit of conquering and holding his state, the means will always be considered honest, and he will be praised by everybody, because the vulgar are always taken by what a thing seems to be and by what comes of it. And in the world there are only the vulgar, for the few find a place there only when the many have no ground to rest on. The Prince. Chapter 19. That one should avoid being despised and hated. Having discussed the specific qualities a prince must navigate, we now turn to a general rule that encompasses them all. A ruler must meticulously avoid anything that renders him hateful or contemptible. If he successfully evades these 2 pitfalls, his position is secure, and other vices will not endanger his reign. As previously noted, nothing breeds hatred more effectively than rapacity, specifically the seizure of subjects' property and women. When a prince abstains from these violations, the vast majority of men live contentedly, leaving him to contend only with the ambition of a few, a threat that can be neutralized with relative ease. Contempt arises when a prince is perceived as variable, frivolous, effeminate, cowardly, or irresolute. These are reefs upon which the ship of state can easily founder, and a prince must steer clear of them, striving instead to project grandeur, courage, gravity, and fortitude in all his actions. In the adjudication of private disputes, his judgments must be irrevocable, establishing a reputation so formidable that no subject dares to deceive or circumvent him. A prince who maintains such standing is guarded by his own reputation. Conspiracy and external attack become difficult when a ruler is known to be excellent and revered by his people. A prince faces 2 primary threats, one internal from his subjects, the other external from foreign powers. Against the latter, he defends himself with good arms and good allies, and he who possesses good arms will never lack for friends. Internal peace is generally assured when external affairs are stable, provided no conspiracies have already taken root. Even amidst external turmoil, a prince who has organized his state and lived according to these precepts will, like Nabis the Spartan, withstand any assault, provided he does not surrender to despair. Regarding subjects, the danger lies in secret conspiracies. The most potent safeguard against treason is to avoid the hatred and scorn of the populace. A conspirator is emboldened by the belief that the death of the prince will please the people. Conversely, If he suspects that his action will provoke their fury, he will lack the heart for such a perilous enterprise, for the obstacles facing a conspirator are infinite. History is replete with conspiracies, but few have succeeded. A plotter cannot act alone, yet he can only seek confederates among the malcontents. The moment he reveals his secret to a dissatisfied spirit, he hands that man the means to contentment, for by betraying the plot, the informer secures immediate reward. Standing between a certain gain on one hand and a perilous, doubtful cause on the other, a man must be a rare friend or an implacable enemy of the prince to keep his silence. The Kingdom of France offers a lesson in wise governance. Among its many sound institutions, the Parliament stands preeminent as the guardian of the king's liberty and security. The founder of that kingdom, recognizing the ambition of the nobles and the hatred of the common people, sought a mechanism to restrain the former and protect the latter without directly involving the king. He established a third judge to humble the great and favor the weak, thereby shielding the monarch from the resentment of the nobles and the suspicion of the masses. There is no subtler or more prudent arrangement. From this we draw a notable conclusion. A prince should delegate to others the enactment of unpopular measures, while reserving for himself the distribution of favors. Some may argue that the lives of the Roman emperors contradict this view, citing rulers who lived nobly and showed great virtue, yet lost their empire or their lives to conspiracy. A close examination of these reigns reveals that the causes of their ruin align perfectly with my arguments. The Roman emperors faced a third, unique difficulty: the cruelty and avarice of the soldiery. It was a perilous balancing act, for the people yearned for peace and thus favored a moderate prince, while the legions loved a warlike leader, one who was insolent, cruel, and rapacious, so that they might double their pay and indulge their own greed. Those emperors who could not by nature or artifice maintain a reputation that held both factions in check were invariably ruined. Marcus Aurelius, Pertinax, and Alexander Severus were all men of modest life, lovers of justice and enemies of cruelty. Yet all but Marcus came to a tragic end. Marcus lived and died honored because he succeeded by hereditary right, owing no debt to soldiers or people, and his own boundless virtues commanded the respect of both. Pertinax, however, was made emperor against the will of a soldiery accustomed to the licentiousness of Commodus. His attempt to impose order bred hatred, which, coupled with contempt for his old age, destroyed him. Alexander was of such goodness that it is said no man was put to death without trial in his 14 years. Yet he was deemed effeminate and dominated by his mother, leading the army to conspire and kill him. Conversely, consider Commodus, Septimius Severus, Antoninus Caracalla, and Maximinus. These were cruel and rapacious men who satisfied the soldiers at the expense of the people. All save Severus died miserably. Severus, though he oppressed the people, possessed such valor that he kept the soldiers friendly and the people awestruck. He serves as a masterclass in playing both the fox and the lion. Knowing the Emperor Julian was weak, Severus persuaded his troops to march on Rome to avenge the death of Pertinax. Upon arrival, the Senate elected him out of fear. To secure the empire, he attacked his rival Niger in the east while deceiving Albinus in the west with the offer of the title of Caesar. Once Niger was defeated, Severus returned and stripped Albinus of both government and life. His son, Antoninus Caracalla, also possessed excellent martial qualities that endeared him to the legions. However, his cruelty was so monstrous, slaughtering much of the populace of Rome and Alexandria, that he became the object of universal hatred. He was eventually assassinated in the midst of his own army by a centurion. This teaches us that a prince cannot easily protect himself against a resolute man who does not fear death. Yet such assassinations are rare. The prince need only avoid doing grave injury to those who serve him closely, a precaution Antoninus neglected by threatening the very man who guarded him. Commodus, inheriting the empire from Marcus, had only to walk in his father's footsteps, but his brutal and bestial nature led him to indulge the soldiers and debase his own dignity by fighting in the gladiator arenas. Despised by the troops for his lack of majesty and hated by the people for his cruelty, he was conspired against and killed. Maximinus, a warlike man elected after the soft Alexander, did not last long. His low birth as a shepherd and his delay in entering Rome bred contempt, while the cruelties committed by his prefects bred hatred. The whole world, Africa, the Senate, the people of Rome, and finally his own army, conspired against him to escape his barbarity. Chapter 20. Are fortresses, and many other things to which princes often resort, advantageous or hurtful? Princes have employed various expedients to secure their states: disarming subjects, partitioning towns into factions, fostering enmities against themselves, winning over initial suspects, and building or destroying fortresses. First, a new prince must never disarm his subjects. Rather, if he finds them unarmed, he must arm them. By doing so, those arms become his own, the suspect become faithful, and the faithful remain so. Since not all can be armed, the benefits bestowed upon the privileged few bind them to the prince, while the unarmed excuse him, recognizing the necessity of military merit. To disarm them is to offend them, implying a distrust born of cowardice or lack of faith, both of which breed hatred. Furthermore, a prince cannot stand unarmed. He would be forced to turn to mercenary troops, whose worthlessness we have already demonstrated. In a newly acquired state annexed to an old one, however, the prince must disarm the new subjects, excepting those who aided his acquisition, and even these must be gradually weakened and rendered effeminate. Regarding factions, our ancestors claimed Pistoia was held by factions and Pisa by fortresses. This may have served in stable times, but in times of war, it is fallacious. Divided cities fall quickly to the enemy, for the weaker faction will always treat with the invader. Venice, by fostering the Guelph and Ghibelline split, thought to keep her subjects occupied, but after the defeat at Vaila, one faction rose up and seized the state. Factionalism argues weakness in the prince. A vigorous ruler does not permit such divisions. It is said that a wise prince, opportunity permitting, should cunningly foster some enmity against himself, that by crushing it he may increase his renown. Moreover, princes often find more loyalty in men who were initially suspect than in those who were trusted from the start. Pandolfo Petrucci of Siena ruled more with those he had distrusted than with others. Men who are initially hostile but need support to maintain their position are easily won over. They serve the prince with greater zeal to cancel out the bad opinion he held of them. Those who serve in security often neglect the prince's interests for their own. Lastly, concerning fortresses, they are useful or not depending on the times. If a prince fears his own people more than foreigners, he should build them. If he fears foreigners more, he should leave them be. The castle of Milan has brought more trouble to the house of Sforza than any disorder in the state. The best fortress in the world is not to be hated by the people. Even if you have fortresses, they will not save you if the people rise up, for foreigners will always appear to assist rebels. The Countess of Forli was aided by a fortress after her husband's murder, allowing her to wait for help from Milan. But when Cesare Borgia attacked and the people joined him, the fortress availed her nothing. It is safer to avoid the hatred of the populace than to rely on stone walls. Chapter 21. How a Prince Should Conduct Himself so as to Gain Renown. Nothing elevates a prince like great enterprises and the setting of a rare example. We have the contemporary instance of Ferdinand of Aragon, King of Spain. From a weak king, he has become the foremost monarch of Christendom. His assault on Granada at the start of his reign laid the foundation of his state, keeping the minds of the barons of Castile occupied with war rather than innovation. He utilized money from the church and the people to build a formidable military. Under the cloak of religion, he executed a pious cruelty by expelling the Moors, a pitiable yet admirable act. He attacked Africa, Italy, and France, always plotting great things that kept his subjects in a state of suspense and wonder, leaving no time for men to work against him. A prince is also respected when he is a true friend or a downright enemy, that is, when he declares himself without reservation. Neutrality is rarely advantageous. If two neighbors war, the victor will not want a doubtful friend, and the loser will not harbor one who did not share his fate. Antiochus, entering Greece, asked the Achaeans for neutrality, while the Romans asked for their arms. The Roman legate rightly said, "Neutrality will leave you the prize of the conqueror without thanks or dignity." A prince should never ally with one more powerful than himself to attack others unless driven by necessity, for victory leaves him at the mercy of his ally. The Venetians ruined themselves by allying with France against Milan. Finally, a prince must show himself a lover of merit, honoring those who excel in every art. He should encourage his citizens to pursue their callings in commerce and agriculture without fear of confiscation or excessive taxes. He should entertain the people with festivals and shows at appropriate seasons. He should respect the guilds and societies of his city, associating with them while maintaining the majesty of his rank, which must never be compromised. The Prince. Chapter 22. Concerning the secretaries of princes. The selection of ministers is a matter of no small importance to a prince, and their worth depends entirely upon his own prudence. The first estimate one forms of a ruler's intelligence is based on the men he keeps around him. When they are capable and faithful, he may always be considered wise, because he has known how to recognize their ability and how to command their loyalty. But when they are otherwise, one cannot form a favorable judgment of him, for the first error he makes is in this choice. There was no one who knew Messer Antonio da Venafro as the servant of Pandolfo Petrucci, Prince of Siena, who did not judge Pandolfo to be a most valiant man for having such a minister. For there are three classes of intellects: one which comprehends by itself, another which appreciates what others comprehend, and a third which neither comprehends by itself nor by the showing of others. The first is the most excellent, the second is good, the third is useless. Therefore it follows necessarily that if Pandolfo was not in the first rank, he was in the second, for whenever one has judgment to know good and bad when it is said and done, although he himself may not have the initiative, yet he can recognize the good and the bad in his servant, and the one he can praise and the other correct. Thus the servant cannot hope to deceive him and is kept honest. But to enable a prince to form an opinion of his servant, there is one test which never fails. When you see the servant thinking more of his own interests than of yours, and seeking inwardly his own profit in everything, such a man will never make a good servant, nor will you ever be able to trust him. Because he who has the state of another in his hands ought never to think of himself but always of his prince, and never pay any attention to matters in which the prince is not concerned. On the other hand, to keep his servant honest, the prince ought to study him, honoring him, enriching him, doing him kindnesses, sharing with him the honors and cares, and at the same time let him see that he cannot stand alone, so that many honors may not make him desire more, many riches make him wish for more, and that many cares may make him dread changes. When, therefore, servants and princes towards servants are thus disposed, they can trust each other, but when it is otherwise, the end will always be disastrous for either one or the other. Chapter 203. How flatterers should be avoided. I do not wish to leave out an important branch of this subject, for it is a danger from which princes are with difficulty preserved, unless they are very careful and discriminating. It is that of flatterers, of whom courts are full, because men are so self-complacent in their own affairs, and in a way so deceived in them, that they are preserved with difficulty from this pest, and if they wish to defend themselves, they run the danger of falling into contempt. Because there is no other way of guarding oneself from flatterers, except letting men understand that to tell you the truth does not offend you. But when everyone may tell you the truth, respect for you abates. Therefore, a wise prince ought to hold a third course by choosing the wise men in his state, and giving to them only the liberty of speaking the truth to him, and then only of those things of which he inquires, and of none others. But he ought to question them upon everything, and listen to their opinions, and afterwards form his own conclusions. With these counselors, separately and collectively, he ought to carry himself in such a way that each of them should know that the more freely he shall speak, the more he shall be preferred. Outside of these, he should listen to no one, pursue the thing resolved on, and be steadfast in his resolutions. He who does otherwise is either overthrown by flatterers, or is so often changed by varying opinions that he falls into contempt. I wish on this subject to adduce a modern example. Fra Luca, the man of affairs to Maximilian, the present emperor, speaking of his majesty, said, "He consulted with no one, yet never got his own way in anything. This arose because of his following a practice the opposite to the above. For the emperor is a secretive man. He does not communicate his designs to anyone, nor does he receive opinions on them. But as in carrying them into effect they become revealed and known, they are at once obstructed by those men whom he has around him, and he, being pliant, is diverted from them. Hence it follows that those things he does one day he undoes the next, and no one ever understands what he wishes or intends to do, and no one can rely on his resolutions. A prince, therefore, ought always to take counsel, but only when he wishes and not when others wish. He ought rather to discourage everyone from offering advice unless he asks it. But however, he ought to be a constant inquirer and afterwards a patient listener concerning the things of which he inquired. Also, on learning that anyone, on any consideration, has not told him the truth, he should let his anger be felt, and if there are some who think that a prince who conveys an impression of his wisdom is not so through his own ability, but through the good advisers that he has around him, beyond doubt they are deceived, because this is an axiom which never fails, that a prince who is not wise himself will never take good advice unless by chance he has yielded his affairs entirely to one person who happens to be a very prudent man. In this case, indeed, he may be well governed, but it would not be for long, because such a governor would, in a short time, take away his state from him. But if a prince who is not inexperienced should take counsel from more than one, he will never get united counsels, nor will he know how to unite them. Each of the councillors will think of his own interests, and the prince will not know how to control them or to see through them, and they are not to be found otherwise, because men will always prove untrue to you unless they are kept honest by constraint. Therefore it must be inferred that good counsels, whencesoever they come, are born of the wisdom of the prince, and not the wisdom of the prince from good counsels. The Prince. Chapter 24. Why the princes of Italy have lost their states. The prudent observation of the rules previously set forth will enable a new prince to appear firmly established and ancient in his power, rendering him more secure than if he had possessed the state by lineage. For the actions of a new prince are watched more closely than those of a hereditary one, and when these actions are seen to be virtuous, they win men over and bind them more tightly than ancient blood. Men are moved more by things of the present than of the past. Finding the present good, they enjoy it and seek no further. They will defend the prince to the utmost if he does not fail himself. Thus, he will have the double glory of having founded a new principality and adorned it with good laws, good arms, and good examples. Just as he has double shame who, being born a prince, loses his state through lack of wisdom. Consider those Italian lords who have lost their states in our times, such as the King of Naples and the Duke of Milan. In them, one finds a common defect regarding arms, as previously discussed. Furthermore, some had the people as enemies, or if the people were friendly, they did not know how to secure the nobles. Without these defects, states that have enough vigor to keep an army in the field are not lost. Philip of Macedon, not the father of Alexander, but he who was conquered by Titus Quintius, possessed a small state compared to the greatness of the Romans and Greeks who attacked him. Yet, being a martial man who knew how to entertain the people and secure the nobles, he sustained the war for many years, and though he lost dominion over some cities, he retained his kingdom. Therefore, let not our princes blame fortune for the loss of their principalities after so many years of possession, but rather their own sloth. In quiet times they never thought that things could change. It is a common human failing not to anticipate the storm during the calm. When adversity struck, they thought of flight, not defense, hoping the people, disgusted by the insolence of the conquerors, would recall them. This course is good only when others fail, but it is ruinous to neglect other remedies for this one. One should never fall in the belief that someone will be there to pick you up. Even if it happens, it is not safe, for that defense is base and does not depend on you. The only reliable, certain, and durable defenses are those that depend on yourself and your own valor. Chapter 25. What fortune can effect in human affairs and how to withstand her. It is not unknown to me that many have held and still hold the opinion that the affairs of the world are governed by fortune and by God, that men with their prudence cannot correct them, and thus there is no remedy. Consequently, they judge that one should not sweat much over things, but let chance govern. This opinion has gained credit in our time due to the great variation of affairs seen every day beyond all human conjecture. Sometimes, thinking on this, I have been partly inclined to their opinion. Nevertheless, so that our free will not be extinguished, I judge it true that fortune may be the arbiter of half our actions, but that she leaves the other half, or nearly so, to be governed by us. I compare fortune to one of those ruinous rivers that, when enraged, floods the plains, tears down trees and buildings, and strips the earth from one place to lay it in another. Everyone flees before it, everyone yields to its fury, unable to withstand it. Yet though it is of such a nature, it does not follow that men, when the weather is calm, cannot make provision with dikes and banks, so that when it rises again, it may pass through a canal or its force be less unrestrained and dangerous. So it is with fortune. She shows her power where virtue has not prepared to resist her, and she turns her impetus where she knows no barriers have been built to hold her. If you consider Italy, the seat of these changes and the one who gave them motion, you will see a country without dikes and without any wall of defense. Had it been shielded by proper virtue, like Germany, Spain, or France, this flood would not have caused such great changes, or it would not have come at all. Restricting myself to particulars, I say, one sees a prince happy today and ruined tomorrow without any change in his nature or qualities. This arises, I believe, first from the causes discussed at length above. The prince who relies entirely on fortune is destroyed when she changes. I also believe that he is happy who adapts his mode of proceeding to the quality of the times, and he is unhappy whose procedure disagrees with the times. For men proceed towards the glory and riches they seek by various methods, one with caution, another with impetuosity, one by violence, another by art, one with patience, another with its opposite, and each can succeed by these diverse ways. One also sees two cautious men, one attaining his design and the other not, and similarly two men succeeding equally with different methods, one being cautious and the other impetuous. This results from nothing else than the quality of the times, which conform to their procedure or not. Hence, a man who governs himself with caution and patience will prosper if times and affairs turn in such a way that his administration is good. But if times change, he is ruined because he does not change his mode of proceeding. Nor is any man found so prudent as to know how to accommodate himself to this, either because he cannot deviate from what nature inclines him to, or because, having always prospered by walking one path, he cannot be persuaded to leave it. Therefore, the cautious man, when it is time to be impetuous, does not know how to act and is ruined. Whereas if he changed his nature with the times and affairs, fortune would not change. Pope Julius II proceeded impetuously in all his actions, and he found the times and affairs so compliant with this mode that he always achieved a happy end. Consider his first enterprise against Bologna while Messer Giovanni Bentivogli was still alive. The Venetians were not pleased, nor was the King of Spain. He was still negotiating with France. Yet, with his ferocity and impetuosity, he personally led the expedition. This move made Spain and the Venetians stand suspended and afraid, and on the other hand drew the King of France after him, who, seeing him move and desiring his friendship to humble the Venetians, judged he could not deny him soldiers without open injury. Thus Julius achieved with his impetuous motion what no other pontiff with all human prudence would have done. For if he had waited to leave Rome with terms fixed and things ordered, as any other pope would have done, he would never have succeeded. I conclude, therefore, that since fortune changes and men remain obstinate in their ways, men are happy while they are in accord, and unhappy when they are at variance. I am certainly of this opinion, that it is better to be impetuous than cautious, for fortune is a woman, and if you wish to master her, it is necessary to beat and strike her. And it is seen that she allows herself to be won more by the impetuous than by those who proceed coldly. And therefore, like a woman, she is always a friend to the young, because they are less cautious, more ferocious, and command her with more audacity. Chapter 2015. An exhortation to liberate Italy from the barbarians. Having considered all the things discussed above, and asking myself whether the times were now propitious in Italy to honor a new prince, and if there was matter that would give a prudent and virtuous man the opportunity to introduce a form that would bring honor to him and good to the universality of men there, it seems to me that so many things concur to favor a new prince that I know of no time more fit for it. And if, as I said, it was necessary for the people of Israel to be enslaved to make known the virtue of Moses, and the Persians oppressed by the Medes to discover the greatness of the spirit of Cyrus, and the Athenians dispersed to illustrate the excellence of Theseus, then at present to know the virtue of an Italian spirit, it was necessary that Italy be reduced to her present terms, more enslaved than the Hebrews, more oppressed than the Persians, more scattered than the Athenians, without a head, without order, beaten, despoiled, torn, overrun, and having endured every kind of ruin. Although some glimmer of hope was shown by one individual, making us think he was ordained by God for her redemption, yet it was seen how, at the height of his career, he was rejected by fortune. Now, left as if lifeless, she waits to see who it is that will heal her wounds, put an end to the sacking of Lombardy, the taxation of the kingdom and Tuscany, and cleanse those sores that have long festered. One sees how she prays to God to send someone who shall deliver her from these wrongs and barbarous insolencies. One sees her ready and willing to follow a banner, if only there be one to raise it. Nor is there anyone at present in whom she can place more hope than in your illustrious house, which, with its fortune and virtue, favored by God and the Church of which it is now prince, can make itself the head of this redemption. This will not be difficult if you recall the actions and lives of the men named above, and although those men were rare and marvelous, they were nevertheless men, and each had less opportunity than this. For their enterprise was not more just than this, nor easier, nor was God more their friend than he is yours. Here is great justice, for war is just to those to whom it is necessary, and arms are holy when there is no hope but in them. Here is the greatest willingness, and where the willingness is great, the difficulty cannot be great, provided you take the institutions of those I have proposed as your aim. Moreover, extraordinary things without example have been seen here, brought about by God. The sea has opened, a cloud has shown you the road, the rock has poured forth water, Manna has rained down. Everything has concurred for your greatness. The rest you must do yourself. God does not wish to do everything, so as not to take from us our free will and that part of the glory which belongs to us. It is not marvelous if none of the Italians named above have been able to do what is expected of your illustrious house, or if in so many revolutions and warlike campaigns it seems that military virtue is extinguished. This happens because the old orders were not good, and no one has known how to find new ones. Nothing honors a man rising anew so much as the new laws and new ordinances found by him. When these are well-founded and have greatness in them, they make him revered and admirable, and in Italy there is no lack of matter to introduce every form. Here there is great virtue in the limbs, were it not lacking in the heads. Look at the duels and combats of the few, how the Italians are superior in strength, dexterity, and ingenuity. But when it comes to armies, they do not compare. This proceeds from the weakness of the leaders, for those who know are not obeyed, and each thinks he knows, since there has been no one who, by virtue or fortune, has risen so high that the others yield to him. Hence it happens that for 20 years in so many wars, whenever there has been an exclusively Italian army, it has always made a bad showing. Therefore, if your illustrious house wishes to follow those excellent men who redeemed their countries, it is necessary, before all else, as the true foundation of every enterprise, to provide yourself with your own arms, for there are no more faithful, truer, or better soldiers. And although singly they are good, together they become even better when they see themselves commanded by their prince, and honored and maintained by him. It is necessary, therefore, to prepare such arms, so that with Italian virtue one can defend oneself against foreigners. And although the Swiss and Spanish infantry are esteemed terrifying, both have a defect, by reason of which a third order could not only oppose them, but confide in overcoming them. For the Spaniards cannot withstand cavalry, and the Swiss are afraid of infantry when they meet them in combat as obstinate as themselves. Thus, it is seen that the Spaniards cannot sustain French cavalry, and the Swiss are broken by Spanish infantry. One can therefore recognize the defects of these infantries and invent a new one that can resist cavalry and not fear infantry. This will be achieved by the quality of the arms and the change of orders. These are the things which, newly ordered, give reputation and greatness to a new prince. This opportunity, therefore, must not be allowed to pass, so that Italy may at last see her Redeemer appear. I cannot express with what love he would be received in all those provinces that have suffered from these foreign floods, with what thirst for vengeance, with what obstinate faith, with what piety, with what tears. What gates would close against him? What people would deny him obedience? What envy would oppose him? What Italian would refuse him homage? This barbarian dominion stinks to everyone. Let your illustrious house, therefore, take up this charge with that spirit and that hope with which just enterprises are undertaken, so that under its standard this fatherland may be ennobled, and under its auspices that saying of Petrarch may be verified. Virtue against fury shall take up arms, and the combat will be short, for the ancient valor in Italian hearts is not yet dead.